Okay, so when I see the name Alexander Graham Bell, what's the first thing that pops into your head? It's the telephone, right? The man who connected the entire world. Well, what if I told you that the man who invented the telephone actually kind of hated it? Let's get into it.
I'm not kidding. He considered it such a distraction, such an intrusion on his real work, that he literally refused to have a telephone in his own study. This one fact is the key to understanding who Alexander Graham Bell really was, and it's the central mystery we're unpacking today.
So that just opens up a huge question, right? If the device that made him famous was just an unwelcome interruption, then what was the real work he was so desperate to protect? What was the true driving force behind one of history's most brilliant minds? To figure that out, we have to look way past the invention and get to know the man himself. See, his passion wasn't born in some lab full of wires and gadgets. It came from a world of, well, a world of profound silence. Bell grew up in a family that was completely obsessed with speech. I mean, his grandfather was an elocutionist, and his father was a famous phonetician who created a system called visible speech, basically a way to write down sounds. Young Bell got so good at it, he could look at symbols and recite sounds from any language, even Sanskrit, without even knowing the words. But the biggest influence on him, the thing that really drove his work, wasn't professional at all. It was deeply, deeply personal. The two most important women in his entire life, his mother, Eliza, and later his wife, Mabel, were both deaf. And that one fact, well, that changed everything. It didn't just shape his life, it pretty much became his life's work. So here's the key thing to understand. His first experiments with acoustics weren't about inventing something to sell. They were about connection. He actually figured out that if he spoke in clear, low tones right against his mother's forehead, she could feel the vibrations and hear him. His entire career at its core was about building a bridge between the world of sound and the world of silence. And that's where the telephone comes in. See, it was never the main goal. It was almost an accident, a byproduct. He was actually trying to create something called a harmonic telegraph to help deaf people hear. And that research is what accidentally sent him down the path to creating one of the most valuable patents in history. And wow, what a path it was. It all came to a head in this incredibly dramatic, down-to-the-wire race. We're talking Valentine's Day, 1876. On the very same morning, Bell's lawyer filed his patent application, and his rival, Elisha Gray, filed something called a caveat for a super similar design. The timing was so tight, people have been arguing about it for over 100 years. But in the end, Bell was the one who was awarded the patent. And this, right here, this is the prize. This is the actual drawing from what many people have called the single most valuable patent ever issued. This piece of paper would make him famous, it would make him rich, but it would also drag him away from what he felt was his true calling. And it didn't take long. Just 3 days after that patent was issued, history was made. Bell, working on his device, spoke those now famous words to his assistant in the next room. The distraction had officially been born. So, once the telephone company was up and running, Bell finally had the money and the freedom to get back to his real passions. And let me tell you, he was just getting warmed up. Okay, check this out. He invented something called the photophone. It was a device that could transmit sound on a beam of light. I want you to just think about that for a second. Sending sound on a beam of light. Back in 1880, this was basically the world's very first wireless phone call, a direct ancestor of the fiber optic technology we use today. And in his own words, Bell said this was his masterpiece, the photophone. He called it the greatest invention I have ever made, greater than the telephone. That says it all, doesn't it? But he was far from done. He got fascinated with speed, with flight. He designed this thing called a hydrofoil, the HD-4. It was basically a boat that would rise up out of the water on skis. And in 1919, it absolutely shattered the world marine speed record, hitting almost 71 miles an hour. Just incredible. And that interest in speed led him to the skies. He founded and poured his own money into the Aerial Experiment Association. Their plane, the Silver Dart, made the very first powered flight in Canadian history. The guy's curiosity was just limitless. So when you add it all up, he had 18 patents in his name alone,
plus another 12 he shared with others. And they were for everything, from flying machines to a primitive metal detector he whipped up to try and find the bullet in President James Garfield after he was shot.
But it's not a simple story. Bell's legacy has a really complicated side. His lifelong dedication to the deaf community, which was so personal to him, also led him into the very complex and honestly controversial field of heredity and eugenics. So he published this paper back in 1883, where he warned that if deaf people tended to marry other deaf people, it could eventually result in the emergence of what he called a deaf race. And it's this work that has linked his name to the eugenics movement, which, as we know now, is a really problematic chapter in scientific history.
But it is really important to look at the full picture here, based on the historical record. His stated goal wasn't segregation, it was integration. He was a huge promoter of teaching the deaf to speak, a method called oralism, instead of using sign language, which is a debate that, believe it or not, still goes on today. But here's what's really important. The records show he was explicitly against any laws that would stop people from marrying who they wanted to marry. And he never, ever proposed or even mentioned sterilizing deaf people in any of his writings. And in the end, his story comes full circle in this incredibly powerful way. On the day of his funeral, the very invention he found so intrusive paid him the ultimate respect. For 1 full minute, every single telephone on the North American continent went completely silent in his honor.
Which really leaves us with this one big question to think about. How should we remember him? Is Alexander Graham Bell simply the father of the telephone? Or was he this brilliant, complicated genius who was constantly being interrupted by his own greatest success, always just trying to get back to the work that he felt truly mattered?